I'd like to welcome you all to this really important discussion that CEDA is hosting on the risks and opportunities of public infrastructure investment. There is no doubt that infrastructure has come to the fore as a key economic and political issue for all levels of government. There is an inherent challenge in the delivery of infrastructure to underpin economic development and unlock economic potential. There is also no doubt that infrastructure was a significant political issue for both the state and the national elections, the politics around the funding of the South Road upgrade being a case in point. Public awareness and perceptions in respect of public infrastructure investment are undoubtedly key factors now in all political decision-making. Aside from its prominence in elections, though, there was a significant development in respect of public infrastructure investment which occurred quite recently, on the 13th of August this year. Utopia arrived on the ABC. To those who haven't been watching, Utopia is a political satire focused on the nation-building authority, the NBA, tasked with building the nation through visionary, large-scale infrastructure projects. It is a significant step for public infrastructure investment to be the focus of political satire. In short, the government's role with respect to infrastructure has entered the psyche of Australians, and Utopia demonstrates certain preconceptions as to government's approach and track record on infrastructure delivery. While it is a comedy, it is premised on the audience being able to relate to the satire, else no one would get the jokes. While it is satire and is intended to be humorous and entertaining, it is also part of popular social commentary now. Indeed, Utopia reflects the significant difficulties for government in delivering infrastructure projects, albeit in a very exaggerated form. Historically, governments in Australia have taken a lead role in infrastructure projects either by direct provision or through alliances with the private sector. South Australia is now in a very interesting space in this respect. My first degree is in history, and as a historian, I can see the parallels between the opening up of the prospectivity of the Cooper Basin in the 1970s and the issues that are now facing South Australia in terms of accessing the mineral prospectivity of the Eyre Peninsula. As a lawyer, though, I see coordination difficulties resulting from regulatory structures focused on market outcomes for individual private sector participants in very disparate sectors, sectors that do need to coordinate if we are going to actually realise the potential of the Eyre Peninsula. While the infrastructure needs of the Eyre Peninsula seem obvious, electricity, water, transport, achieving coordinated infrastructure development to unlock the economic potential requires government now to forge a bespoke role in order to optimise societal outcomes. This may qualify as what one of our speakers, Professor Brian Collins, terms a wicked problem. Through today's discussion, I hope that a future role for government in public infrastructure provision can be explored. Please enjoy your lunch, and I'll be back to introduce you to the speakers shortly. Thank you. We're now back with our panel of distinguished speakers, and I'd like to first introduce to you Ian Little. So Ian, perhaps you could give us some of your insights about what you see as the role of government in public infrastructure investment.
Well, that's a very wide question. I've got some ministers or ex-ministers in the room, so I'd be very careful about what I'm about to say. Well, perhaps I'll start off by thinking, I mean, it's always interesting to think what people, mean by infrastructure, because I'm continuously aware at the moment that because infrastructure seems to have this halo about it, that anybody with an investment opportunity can claim the word infrastructure in their prospectus or whatever else they're doing. Everybody says, yeah, well, that sounds great, it's nice, and I guess Macquarie Bank were actually instrumental in that. development of trying to put any business that they floated in the public arena with the words infrastructure and gain significant attraction for only that reason. I tend to think about infrastructure, and we can make it mean whatever we like, but certainly from my point of view, an energy infrastructure it's really about specialised asset building that really can't be transferred to another area. So I necessarily exclude, for example, real estate or buildings and all this sort of thing that can easily be converted to something else. With gas infrastructure in particular, in my expertise area, I suppose, there's not much you can do with a gas pipeline that's going down Rundle Street or going through up to Moomba or wherever else. But even having said that, there are famous examples in the United States of pipelines being converted into telephone line cables or NBN type networks, if you like, but it's very isolated. So I only make that comment in the first instance to say, well, government's involvement in infrastructure, to my mind, is a very important subject, and it's really about governments having the ability to invest in those type of specialist assets that are only of benefit to a wide group of people and not necessarily of benefit to a single or a very small part of the community. And in that sense, I think what we see in Australia today, and South Australia is a perfect example, is the need for government to partner with private entities to develop the new infrastructure, what everybody in this room would recognise as the greenfields type developments, rather than the brownfields one. And I'll probably try and keep this short because we'll go on to another question in a minute, and we'll no doubt come back to this. And I think this idea about greenfields, or where you've got existing infrastructure companies, and there's many of them in Australia, whether telephones, roads, or energy. Speaking particularly for energy, I think I've found over 15 years that I've been involved with Investor, for example, there's very seldom been problems in raising finance for existing companies that have got good track records and a background of government involvement in terms of good regulatory practice. I've found very few occasions where raising large amounts of money, and I think I've raised billions of dollars from investors over the years for infrastructure, has not been an issue. Where there is no doubt an issue is in greenfields developments, whether it's a new road down the South Road or in NBNs or whatever else. I think those are the difficulties for governments, just because for a number of reasons, not least of which is the large amount of capital you need to be able to finance greenfields development, and the unwillingness generally, not only a part of Australian investors but overseas investors, to take on the risk of greenfield development. So I'll come back, and I don't want to dominate the chair.
It's an interesting issue. I'm sure we will come back to it. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Brian Collins. Professor Collins is currently a Director of the International Centre for Infrastructure Futures and a Professor of Engineering Policy at UCL. In my introduction, I gave a bit of insight into the Eyre Peninsula and the issues around opening up the mining prospectivity. Do you think it sounds like a wicked problem, and how would you suggest it's approached?
That sounds like a consultancy engagement almost, doesn't it? Wicked problem isn't something I invented. There's a body of literature, some of which came out of Australia in the first place. In fact, I was mentioning earlier, there's a guidance document that you produced for your own government officials about 10 years ago on how they should deal with wicked problems. Our government didn't have any such thing, your government did. But I haven't found many governments around the world, including yours, who have guidance material on how to actually address the issues of wicked problems. So wicked problems are ones where there's a large number of stakeholders and the outcome is not entirely clear right from the beginning. So you have to start doing it in order to discover exactly what voyage of discovery you're all on. And actually I'd like to add a little bit to that with regard to the answer to your first question to Ian, which is what's the role of government? And I think government in the past has been quite interventionist in putting forward ideas of what are good ideas or not. I think their role in the future, because the multiplicity of stakeholders that have an interest in a large-scale infrastructure program such as the one you mentioned, is to be a convener of the table around which all those issues are put in place, with some powers of producing some level of arbitration between disparate views, but not to be the dominant factor, because that immediately gets you into gladiatorial politics. which tends not to produce any useful outcome, any decisions, any way forward. All it does is produce lots of hot air and no action. Whereas if you're a convener with some level of arbitration power, you've got a softer approach to how you take forward this idea that you need political capital, financial capital, environmental capital, social capital, all involved in the decisions around a large program such as the one you mentioned. So I think the role of government is changing, whether it's city government, national government, state government, local government. And indeed all of those have to sit around a table as well, because they don't necessarily all agree, but they all have a stake in an issue. So what we're doing in our research program, you mentioned my directorship of a research grant, is to try and understand what are the new business models that all of the players have to think about adopting in order to produce better outcomes for everybody. So the status quo doesn't appear to be delivering useful outcomes. So what is it needs to be remedied, not necessarily because it's broken, it's just not appropriate, not fit for purpose any longer, because we are now dealing with more complex situations. So what we're doing is examining on an international basis. It's why I'm delighted to be invited to be here today, to hear the feedback from you guys who do this sort of stuff as to what is your experience. Because all developed countries are trying to maintain themselves as developed countries. We quite like being a developed country because we see what happens if we're not. And yet it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we all get around the table and sort out how we're going to maintain ourselves in a developed world. And indeed, more importantly, for probably 7/8 of the world, help the rest of the world, which isn't developed, develop in a way which is sustainable for everybody. So there is a real market for what we're thinking about here, as well as something which is good for us.
That sounds like a real call to coordinated action.
That's the ambition, absolutely. Collaboration is the name of the word, not just not excluding competition. It's actually how do competition and collaboration coexist in the right way.
Thank you. I'd also like to introduce you Professor Arthur Petersen. Professor Peterson is currently a Professor of Environmental Public Policy at UCL within the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. So Arthur, I'd like to know a bit about what you think needs to be the stimulus for society to actually come to grips with major infrastructure changes.
So what I would like to introduce to you, I'm very interested to hear feedback about the situation in Australia and South Australia, is an area where I've been heavily involved in as the Chief Scientist for Environmental Infrastructure in the Netherlands, in terms of the public infrastructure related to flooding, flood risk, and what's triggering public investment in that, and what's determining also the specification of what the flood defenses should look like. And, well, we have this experience of our big flood in 1953, so what was triggering then was a major disaster, and then something was designed, the Delta Works, and in essence nothing has changed since we decided to build the Delta Works, also in terms of standard setting. What recently happened, and this was it was an innovation in the Dutch infrastructure policy making, was that we said we shouldn't wait for the next disaster to happen, and we do know that there are all kinds of changes happening, both in, let's say, society. Where are the assets, what needs more protection and less, but also the rivers keep changing. Of course, people have been keeping up with that, but there was no process really in place to plan also for decades ahead in terms of what investments should be made. And of course, climate change is a factor coming in as well. Very uncertain, we don't know in particular seasons whether it will be raining more or raining less. But still, we need to build in resilience and robustness in the system. So what happened was, that there has been a new process in place, which is now delivering in a few weeks from now a final national decision, which was built by a special Delta commissioner, which had the authority to bring governments and all levels of government together with water boards, but also industry and others, to make a plan which is adaptive in design, which makes clear that there will be moments where we will be revisiting the norms. There will be moments where we will be looking at new technology, new types of dikes, new ways to deal with risks, because one of the things you can do is you can build a dike which may be a flooding, but the dike will remain there so there will not be a major disaster, so it will be only a couple of inches of water coming, etc., etc. There are all kinds of new ways of thinking about about risk, of managing it. And I think this is a nice innovation, and it was possible in our country to get all the actors together, all political parties, and all levels of government and industry, and build a process which was trusted. So I'm really, really, really keen to hear about the situation in Australia with respect to flood risk and what's coming. Also to hear in terms of climate change, there will be more extreme precipitation events, and how are you prepared for that?
Thank you, Arthur. Our last distinguished speaker is Dr. Mikkel Acuto, also a Director of Research and Senior Lecturer in Global Networks and Diplomacy, also with UCL's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. Mikkel, I know that you've got an interest in splintering urbanism. I was wondering if you could explain to the audience what the concept is and how you see its relevance to Australia.
It's funny to sound that I'm the academic one after the one that has 2 PhDs, but yes, thanks, Caroline. I suppose that she said cities enough times to point out that I work on urban infrastructure for the most part. Yes, just to render a bit of something that we're seeing in the project with the World Bank and UN Habitat. And in a nutshell, that's really a concerted effort of UCL, UN Habitat, and the bank to trying to get a bit of context when we talk about urban infrastructure, or urban more in general. So what we're doing is literally looking across more than 200 cities globally, trying to benchmark a bit strategic orientation and strategic trends on how we're building cities or rebuilding cities. And I suppose the mouthful of we never really talk about, or we don't talk enough about splintering infrastructures and urbanism when we talk about infrastructure, is a very simple concept. When you look at cities, whether it's Adelaide, I've worked for many years on Sydney, Dubai, London and so forth, you actually already have some form of infrastructure. The proportion of brand new, newly built infrastructure is relatively limited to what's already there. And it's quite important. It's quite important not just from a financial point of view, but from a societal, cultural, and political point of view. What we see, and hopefully I render some justice to the team working at home, so hopefully they're not going to kill me when I go back and I say this. But if you look across a landscape like 200 cities, and if you look at infrastructure, how it's been built, you're really seeing this infrastructure splintering into multiple layers of similar types of infrastructure. Connectivity in terms of transport, we've seen it in the last State of Australian Cities in 2013. It really is creating multiple layers of the same thing. Multiple layers of energy provisions, multiple layers of mobility, multiple layers of access to a large place like Sydney, which in principle is not bad until those different layers have different levels of access. The idea of creating a second Sydney airport is pretty interesting. Some people would be against it, some people would be pro, but it really creates an alternative way to get to Sydney. And it really creates an alternative market to get to Sydney. It really creates different modalities of access, but not everyone can access that. It's an interesting thought experiment because it really says try and scale up and down the conversations that you have in South Australia as much as in Queensland and as much as in New South Wales. We tend to talk about infrastructure at the state level. There's a little bit of talk at the federal level. I know it's a little bit of contentious discussion to have anyway. If you scale it down to the urban level, you really bump against fast splintering varieties of infrastructure, which are rarely taken into account. And ironically, something like State of Australian Cities 2013 or 2012, it's produced by a Department of Infrastructure, a major cities unit, and it doesn't have an infrastructure section. It talks about everything but infrastructure, which is rather ironic when you see that sort of effect of splintering. And I suppose that the main concern that we have or that we see there is who's building that kind of infrastructure. We do talk about the governance, we do talk about the government, we do talk about the financing. What we don't talk enough about is the sort of stuff that Steve Rayner talks about in Oxford, that Simon Marvin talks about in Durham, at Durham University. It's the lock-ins that we get ourselves into once we've built that infrastructure. It's the fact that if I co-finance a pipeline with insert company, because there's cameras, if I co-finance an airport in Sydney with insert companies, that model carries on and carries on far beyond the political cycle, far beyond even cultural cycles. We see very, very little consideration of that type of lock-in and path dependency, which really creates the part of the wicked problems that Brian's talking about.
Thanks, Mikkel. So you can see our panel has a range of expertise and experiences, but all share a common passion around infrastructure. I'd like to now throw it into the floor. If anyone's got a question or a comment that they'd like to put to the panel, please just raise your hand. We've got a roving mic which will come around to you.